Hey, just a brief note to the listener. This week, I got through the podcast and I realized we were going to be more than 30 minutes. And there's too much good information to just shorten the podcast up. So what I did was I've broken it into 2 episodes. So you've got this week's episode, and we're going to stop midway through the episode. So it's going to be a little bit of an awkward stopping point, but we're going to stop before we address the issue of free will. We'll carry free will and some other things into next episode. I'm going to release them both back to back pretty close together. But this way we'll get a little bit more information in without it being too long of a podcast. So with no further ado, we'll jump in and get going. Welcome back to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell. And this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, this week, what we're looking at, we're going to try to wrap up this question of were we created or did we evolve? We've got one last little piece in looking at this on this question of consciousness. And it's going to take a couple of episodes to get through. As I started researching this, I realized this is a way bigger topic, I think, than a lot of people realize. Bigger topic than I realized. And then we're going to finish by looking at morality and the question of objective moral values and things like that, how they point to a creator. Somewhere in the middle in here, we're obviously approaching Christmas, so we'll have a couple of Christmas episodes in there, and we'll probably end up wrapping up the morality piece in January as we go forward. So a couple different things coming at us. I want a couple of references that I want to point you to as we look at this, a couple of great resources. I know I've referenced this before, Lee Strobel's book, Case for a Creator. Fantastic read. The last chapter in here before the conclusion focuses in on that topic. He interviews J.P. Moreland. Fantastic interview talking about consciousness. And then I had the opportunity on the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast. I was listening to a podcast the other day with Frank Turek and Dr. Michael Egnor. And Dr. Egnor is a neurosurgeon who has, I think, something like 7,000 cases that he's performed over his career. And he and Denyse in their book, The Immortal Mind, is a fantastic read. It's a short read, but it's an amazing read. He goes through and talks about making his case for the existence of a human soul, that we are more than just our brain. And we're going to have to define our terms as we go through this, because a lot of times we confuse the term brain and mind. And they are 2 separate things. If neo-Darwinian evolution is correct, they are one thing. And so that idea would be that if neo-Darwinian theory is correct, that gray matter between your ears is everything that you are. You as a person is everything going on here up in your mind and your brain. And there is no difference between your brain and your mind, that the 2 are one thing. That's going to be a bit of an all or nothing proposition here. So this is one of those make or break situations where if neo-Darwinian theory isn't 100% right, it's 100% wrong on this one. There is no middle ground. If we are more than just our brain, if there is something more to us, if there's a difference between our mind and our brain, then that is a gigantic problem that evolution is going to really, really struggle to get past. And Darwinists are just going to have a really difficult time getting past that idea if that is in fact the case. And what I intend to show in the next couple of episodes is the best explanation for our consciousness, for who we are, is again, we always come back to those 2 choices. We are either the result of a neo-Darwinian evolutionary process, or we are the result of an outside third party, an intelligent creator who created us. And again, what I think we're going to see is that the weight of the evidence very clearly points to an intelligent third party who created us, and intelligence being the source for intelligence, being the source for our consciousness in all of this. So we need to look at this. And again, I want to go back and start once again with this quote from Richard Dawkins that we've had, a little bit of fun at Richard Dawkins' expense with this quote over the past few months as we've been looking at this question of were we created or did we evolve? And the point of going back to this quote is to show how often neo-Darwinian theorists have to rely on luck to get them past this. And I want you to notice there are 3 major stumbling blocks that Dawkins identifies in all of this that clearly from his perspective and that of his colleague, Mark Ridley, that neo-Darwinian evolution is going to really struggle to explain. There are 3 of them, and the first 2 kind of make sense to us because we've talked about them. The third, we kind of look at and go, well, I didn't really ever consider that to be that big of a deal. It says, nevertheless, it may be that the origin of life is not the only major gap in the evolutionary story that is bridged by sheer luck, anthropically justified. For example, my colleague Mark Ridley in Mendel's Demon has suggested that the origin of the eukaryotic cell was an even more momentous, difficult, and statistically improbable step than the origin of life. The origin of consciousness might be another major gap whose bridging was of the same order of improbability. I know when I read that the first couple of times, my reaction to that was, okay, origin of life, I understand. Huge issue, major leap. We've addressed those problems in the past. The development of the eukaryotic cell, the complexity of life, huge issue, major problem, I understand it. I had really never delved that much into the question of consciousness and how big of a problem consciousness is for neo-Darwinian theory. And it fundamentally makes good sense. If you go all the way back to, some of the early, not earliest philosophers, if you go back several hundred years ago and you start looking at philosophers, I think one of the quotes that we all know is Descartes' quote of, I think, therefore I am. But a lot of times we don't necessarily follow that very far and consider what we're talking about here. We have an amazing dog. That's her. That's Remy. Remy is an English Springer Spaniel. She is, and this is going to be probably the most controversial comment I make because there are going to be a lot of people who disagree with me out there. Remy is the best dog in the world. We just adore her. She has the sweetest disposition. She is everything you want in a dog. She's not very smart, but you know what? We've come to learn over the years with her. That's okay. We really didn't need a rocket scientist for a dog. We wanted an animal who was sweet and loving. And oh my goodness, she's just the best. And as you can see, she's just adorable. She lets my wife put her in all of these, ridiculous costumes at Halloween, and she is such a good sport, and she just has the best temperament. When I ask her if she wants a dog treat, she knows that. And she comprehends what that means. And she immediately sits up at attention. She will beg. She'll do whatever she needs to do to get that dog treat. But that's about as far as Remy goes. Remy has certain commands that she knows. She can do basic dog things. She's a very well-behaved dog. But Remy is never going to be able to ponder the great questions of life. She's never even going to be able to ponder the small questions of life, like, have they given me too many treats today? Am I starting to get a little chunky? And sadly, the answer is yes, she is. But she can't, there is no why with her. She doesn't think on that level. So when we look at Descartes' quote of, I think, therefore I am, what exactly is he getting at in all of this? And so let's kind of dive into this, because a lot of times we have these inferences made for us and these quotations thrown at us about, we're just descended from apes, and there's only this teeny tiny bit of difference in our DNA between us and the primates that we supposedly evolved from. The problem is there's an inexplicable gap in there, especially when we reach this issue. I want to quote starting from Dr. Egnor's book, Dr. Egnor and Denyse O'Leary's book. He says, we often hear that chimpanzees and human DNA differ by a mere 1%, but humans are radically different from chimpanzees, intellectually, morally, and culturally. Well, then, we can be sure that some very important things about us are not found in our DNA. Human exceptionalism is the difference between a clever ape's mind and Einstein's mind, and he's exactly right about that. Because he also says, we humans are the only living creatures on the planet who think about mathematics, science, literature, philosophy, religion, and the whole range of abstract ideas. As much as I love Remy, and she is such a great dog, there's never going to be a good conversation between her and I. I talk to her and she looks at me very lovingly, but there's not a lot going on between those fuzzy little ears of hers. And it's not about the size of her brain. The creature with the largest brain on the planet is a sperm whale. But a sperm whale is not contemplating its existence just based on the size of its brain. The largest land animal, the largest brain in a land animal, is an elephant. And again, I don't think we're expecting any kind of a battle of the brains, a battle of the minds or wits between a human being or an elephant or a sperm whale. It's not about the size of the brain. There's something more going on. We are more, and this is what Dr. Egnor is trying to get at in his book. We are far more than just what that gray matter between our ears. There is something special going on inside of us that just looking at our brains really doesn't explain it. The Bible puts it this way to us. We are unique. We are creatures who are made in God's image. We are made at a very different level than all of the other animals. And the Bible lays that out in enormous detail over and over again from Genesis to Revelation, that we are unlike any other creature in creation. And so again, the Bible's explanation would be, well, the reason that you're different than an elephant, even though an elephant has a larger brain capacity than we do, is because your God has breathed extra into us. He's breathed not only life into us, but he's made us in his image. And part of that is we have a soul that is radically different. We have a mind that is radically different than any other creature on this planet, even though our brain may not be quite as big. I love, as we look at this, if you kind of define your terms a little bit, the brain is obviously that gray matter that's going on between your ears. Our brain's control is the control center over our body functions. And a lot of our memory resides there and things like that. A lot of, like I said, control over our bodily functions are there. So walking and talking and seeing, all of that is going on and is being processed through our brain. But does it end there, or is there something more? And I love this definition of the mind. And this is, again, this is Dr. Egnor and Denyse O'Leary talking about some research done by a famous neurosurgeon and scientist, Wilder Penfield, who we're going to talk a lot more about him in the next episode. But in looking at this, what Penfield observed, and he did an enormous number of operations on patients, actually operating on the brain while they were awake, as he mapped out what the brain did so that he could avoid injuring the patient while he removed damaged tissue in the brain. One of the things that Penfield noted was, he said, thus he concluded that abstract thought is a function of something other than or beyond the physical brain. He came to define the mind as the element in an individual, quote, that feels, perceives, thinks, wills, and especially reasons. These are the things that we can't find when we go through and we look around. In this research that Penfield did, these are the things that he couldn't find. He was able to stimulate in his research, actually operating on the mind of a patient who was awake and speaking to him. He could evoke memories. He could evoke physical actions. There were things that he could do, but he could never find where our will was, where our reasoning was, where our thought processes and those things like that. There were things that no matter how hard he looked, he was never able to evoke certain things. And Penfield became convinced that there was a difference between the brain and the mind, that they are two separate things in all of this. What Penfield and others have come to understand is that we communicate through our brain via our mind. So our mind is in control of that gray matter between our ears. And that gray matter between our ears, while it controls all of those things, there's a difference between the two of them. It's in here, he speculated, this is Penfield, that the brain might serve as a mechanism to manifest the mind, much in the same way a television set manifests pictures and sound waves from the air. That actually makes a lot of sense. And we're going to talk a lot more about that in the next episode as we look at what happens to somebody who suffers a traumatic brain injury or things like that. What is it that we see and recognize to help us to understand the difference between the mind and the brain? In looking at this self-consciousness or consciousness itself, Webster's dictionary defines consciousness as this quality or state of being aware, especially of something within oneself. The state or fact of being conscious of an external object, state, or fact. The state of being characterized by sensation, emotion, volition, and thought. So Webster starts getting at that. I love this quote from J.P. Moreland from Lee Strobel's book. He says, well, a simple definition is that consciousness is what you're aware of when you introspect, when you think. When you pay attention to what's going on inside of you, that's consciousness. And that's the point that he's getting at in there. Self-consciousness, this is from Dr. Egnor's book, implies not only awareness, but also awareness that one is aware. It's that self-thought, that introspection that you're thinking of. I can remember we were amazed when our youngest daughter reached that point and she began referring to herself as with me in front of her name. And so she would say, me and then her name, recognizing that self-consciousness, that she had reached that point where she was aware, and it seemed to us at an early age that she did that. And I think intuitively we know this, but we don't spend a lot of time actually thinking about it. Going back to J.P. Moreland again, he said, the point is, Lee, I am a soul and I have a body. We don't learn about people by studying their bodies, in other words, studying their brain. We learn about people by finding out how they feel, what they think, what they're passionate about, what their worldview is, and so forth. And what Penfield came to recognize and what Strobel's talking about there, or what J.P. Moreland's talking about there to Lee Strobel, is that you can't find that stuff. That who we are is not located between our ears. When we study that and when we look at it, you physically can't find it. Going again back to Dr. Penfield, Dr. Egnor's book, he says that Penfield observed that the mind has an existence independent of the brain, and that the mind uses the brain to interact with the world in a way that is analogous to a computer program uses a computer to accomplish tasks. Your mind and your brain are two separate things, two very, very different things. He goes on to say the failure to find the material center of consciousness in the brain should be taken seriously. It's not a failure of science, it's a success of science. It's strong scientific evidence that points to the truth about the human soul. We haven't found the material center of consciousness in the brain because the human soul isn't in the brain. Consciousness has no location. The human soul is spiritual. But now another question arises. The human soul has an immaterial and immortal element that cannot just be explained away. So how could we have evolved from an animal mind? And we'll talk about that a little bit further on. I've heard a really good definition of our soul. So we're talking about here multiple things as we get going in this. We've got a mind. We've got a brain that's between our ears. We have a mind that interacts through the brain. We are conscious, which is a part of that. The idea of a human soul I've best heard expressed in just a very easy definition. A soul is the combined mind, will, and emotions of a human being. And there's lots of different definitions of how you might define a soul. But if you think about it from this perspective, a soul is our mind, our will, and our emotions. And if you go back to Penfield's research that Dr. Egnor is talking about here in his book, what Penfield was getting at is when we go looking for those things, we can't find them. There's no place in the brain that they seem to originate from. And that's something that has not changed. Modern scientific evidence is pointing more and more increasingly to that. We're going to talk about that next week. But the fact that we can't find that location of where consciousness is because consciousness isn't exactly tied to us. Consciousness is part of us. It comes through us, but it's more than that. It's not a material part of who we are, even though it's everything of who we are. And that's why this topic is so difficult and different to speak about. It is a very philosophical topic as we look at all of this. I'm going to jump in here for a minute. I'm going to break that last episode up. We're going to call a little time out here. I think this episode would be better served being split into two pieces. So what we're going to do, I'm going to split this episode up right here at this point. Next time, we're going to go ahead and continue this process of looking at philosophical issues related to consciousness. All right. So I want to thank you for joining us this week. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you're getting a lot out of it. Come back for part 2. I'll post part 2 here in just a couple of days to get both of these different pieces out there. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. You can find our podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. You can find more information on our website at prooftograce.com. And you can always reach out to us via email if you'd like at prooftograce@yahoo.com. I want to thank you so much for joining us, and I apologize for the awkward cut here. I thought this might be better broken up into 2 episodes, so we'll kind of go from there. Thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.